Hello again. So this video would be different than the last one. The last one was kind of like a high-level pitch of Fast-gov-uk. Um, in this video, on the other hand, would be coding a bunch of stuff like creating a simple example of a page and as well as a form. So um, yeah, join me. Let's see how this goes. So I'm going to create a new directory where I would put my code in. Uh, let's call it fast intro. CD into it. Um, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create. I use UV. I like UV. So I'm going to use it to create a virtual environment, and I'm going to use it to manage all my dependencies. You can use other things if you like using pip or vn or like poetry. Um, please go ahead and use it. Like it's fine. Like it should probably work. Um, I'm going to use UV in it. I like the fact that I can kind of choose the version of Python. I'm using 3.13 here, but Fast-gov-uk works with a sort of broad set of Python versions, so it should probably work with whatever you have on your machine. I like to be kind of more specific around like the version of Python I'm using. Um, what this does is it creates three files. So there's a README file, there is a main.py file that we can kind of use as our application file, and there's a PyProject file that tracks your dependencies, right? So that's all good. The next thing we can do is we can add Fast-gov-uk to this little project. So that will be like this. Fast-gov-uk is on the cheat shop, right? Like, so you can pip install it, and UV is probably doing that under the hood, and that takes care of installing Fast-gov-uk, and we can quickly test this. Uh-huh. That worked. So that means we have Fast-gov-uk installed in our environment here. Awesome. So what do we do? So well, like let's try something, right? Like let's run something and see how it goes. So we go to the main.py file, remove everything in here. What I can do is I can, well, let's copy and paste the simple example on the Fast-gov-uk docs, right? Like, so this is a simple example. Um, what it does is like it kind of gives you a starter template for creating Fast-gov-uk applications. I'm going to copy this, paste this here, and before I even like discuss the code and like what it does, let's just run it, right? Let's see what, like let's break it even. So UV run Python main.py. So main.py is the module where I chuck my code in. So like UV run uses the version of Python that I've installed in my environment, and just like that's what it is, right? So it's running on my local host. I can go there, and now we get to talk about like what we're seeing in front of our eyes, right? So if I look at the code here, right? So it's importing like fast and serve um, from Fast-gov-uk, and it's also importing design system. I like to do it as DS because otherwise it's a bit of a mouthful everywhere else in the code base. So fast is like the class for instantiating an app object, which kind of like underpins the whole thing, right? So you do it like so. You can also pass it settings, by the way, which is an interesting way to like, like oh, I want to use a database. Here is the URL, and you check it inside fast object, and it just initializes it and starts using it. Serve is just the server, so like this is how like I use it. Once you've created the fast object, it kind of gives you access to like a lot of utility functions, right? Like, so you could do something called, it's a decorator faster page. And so the philosophy here is that like simple GovUK services do two things really well. The first thing is that they try and like they provide information to the users, which is page. And the second thing is that they sort of collect information from the users, right? That's a form. So we've kind of really honed in on these two aspects of simple gov services, right? Can you provide information to your users and can you get information from them, right? So that's what like Fast kind of focuses on. In this simple example, we'll be talking about a page. So the page is called Get Started. It's rendered on the sort of root homepage URL. And then we have like some scaffolding, right? So you can this return thing can return any sort of fast um, gov.uk element. But if you wrap your elements in a page, uh, you get some extra stuff, which is quite useful at times. But I'll come to that. The first thing you're doing is like a warning saying that this is a demo and not a real service. This is fine. It shows up like this, standard GDS like warning component. It is doing an H1, which shows up here. Then it's doing like you can use any kind of like arbitrary um, GDS like design system elements here, right? So you can do a para, you can do a list, make it a bulleted list even. And then finally, there's a start button saying I'm ready, which is taking you to a random URL, which probably doesn't exist, right? So, but all of these things are stuff that I put in, right? Like I specified in my page function, like that this is the page. But the magic is the rest of it is like the fact that I wrap my things in a page sort of object means that the framework knows that you're trying to create a standard gov.uk page. So it knows that a standard gov.uk page needs a header. It kind of provides you with a base banner. It provides you with a footer. All of these things come out of the box. Other things that come out of the box is like a cookies page, right? Like every gov.uk service should have one. This is a very basic one that kind of covers essential cookies, but if your service is using some advanced cookies like analytical stuff, like you can add, you can modify this page to include those, right? And that's fine. But out of the box, if you're not using any advanced cookies, you're covered, right? It also comes out of the box with a form, right? So here is a feedback form that it comes out of the box with. It is in the standard Gov GDS sort of satisfaction survey, right? Like you can fill it up and send feedback, right? Like it did something there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and explain what it did, and that will hopefully provide you with a bit of an intro into how forms work, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is in the documentation, there is a thing called scaffolding for common service patterns, and there is a section in there called feedback, right? And it tells you that user feedback comes out of the box with all Fast-gov.uk services, right? And here is the form that we just filled and submitted, right? And it also gives you the actual code that produced that form, which is nice. And we'll talk about this in more detail when we kind of start talking about how to build your forms. But at this moment in time, what I need you to notice is like, I mean, obviously there's like defining of the form, right? Like what does the form like the elements of a form, right? So there is a heading, there is a smaller heading, there's a radio button with these choices. Um, and yeah, so this one does not have the comment section. I need to probably update it. Um, but the important concept here that I wanted to talk about is called form backends, right? So a backend is a concept in Fast-gov.uk, a bit of code that handles what happens when you submit a valid form. So by default, our feedback form comes with something called a log backend, which is I think is incredibly useful for debugging purposes. I'll show you what happened, like what it looks like. So if you go here, I'll take myself out of the way. Can you see this log? Like this is me submitting the feedback form, right? So it's saying form feedback was processed with satisfaction value of blah and a comment of blah, right? And that's what a log backend does. It kind of picks up from once a form has been submitted uh, and it's valid, the backend takes over and it processes of what to do with the data. And a log backend essentially just logs it. But there are a number of backends in Fast-gov-uk that like out of the box, right? So, and we can, like in this case, I'm trying to sort of change my feedback form to remove the comments and use an email backend. So you could use an email backend that would use, for example, Notify to send you an email whenever a feedback form is submitted. You can use a database backend. And that's like, yeah, that's, I think, that's an intro of what happens when and that's an intro of how, like, like this, a simple example, like me just running it and walking you through all the elements that come out of the box. Let's talk about forms, which is, I think, quite exciting. Um, so um, let's try and modify our feedback form to, for example, randomly like, remove the comments field and maybe use a database backend because I feel like um, it is um, unlike the log backend, like it does something quite interesting. And you would learn how to use databases with your Fast-gov UK services, right? So that will be cool. So if I go here, sorry, not here. If I go here, what I can do is I can um, override the default feedback form with my own feedback form, right? And my own feedback form, I can do whatever I like. Like about what I'd be doing, the way you override this is I'd be creating a feedback form of my own, and I would kind of like hook onto the same URL where the default feedback form is rendered, and that would allow me like that would override the default form with the form that I produce, right? So helpfully, there is a good example for this in the docs, which I was showing you earlier. So this is an example of how you override a feedback form, right? So I take this and I can try and paste it here. Um, there it goes. So this is like a feedback form, just like the other feedback form. But what it's doing is it removed the choice fields. I would, instead of like using an email backend right now, I would probably first graduate to a database backend. And the way you do it, let's start from scratch. So the way you do it is, um, so so first of all, you need to import forms because you'll be using forms now. So forms, that's fine. And then you can do forms.db backend. And over here, you need to kind of, so if you look at the backends documentation here, right? So if I go here and there's an entire section on backends, and you can find the DB backend here. So it gives you examples and such. So it needs an instance of a database, and the way you provide an instance of it, like so when you're creating your application is when you kind of instantiate your databases, right? So over here, I'm passing a dictionary where like there's a database URL called service DB. So let's try and do that first. So over here, I can do database URL, and let's call it service.db because I'm not very creative. Um, and then you can, so that allows you passing the database URL in the sort of the application um, constructor. And that like that initializes that tells the framework that you want to use the database, and the framework does the heavy lifting of initializing it and like making sure it's available for your application, right? And so what that does is like over here you can kind of do like db equals to fast.db, right? So fast.db is where like it's a reference to the database handle that has been already been instantiated by the application sort of constructor, right? Um, and that should be that. And by the way, the backends is like it's a list, and it's not like, so you can have multiple backends, right? So you can kind of still have the log backend, or you can have an email backend, right? So you can have as many backends as you like, and they would sort of serially process the form and do whatever those backends do. So in this case, let's have a log backend and a DB backend. And yeah, enough talking. Let's run it and see see what happens. So running it is the same as before. Run the application, come over here and give feedback. Can you notice that there's no comments field here? So that's the default feedback form comes with a comment field. So we kind of we have overridden the default feedback form, and so it removed the comments field. So if I do the send feedback thing, um, because I was kind of using the log backend, you still get this, right? So um, you still get the feedback was processed with satisfaction satisfied, but you get this like curious new log, right? So feedback was saved with satisfaction satisfied. That's interesting. Let's see what that means. So if I kill my server, you would notice that there is a service DB here. This is SQLite, right? I use SQLite because it's easy to work with, but you can use whatever database you want, right? Like if you're using Postgres, or if you want to use Postgres and just pass in the Postgres URL into the settings, and the framework would revert to resort to using Postgres, and that's fine. That should just work. But what we can do here is that because we save some data, so we can inspect the database, right? So I can open, or I should be able to open a service.db. It's probably best to do this because I want to see pretty tables, and then I can do forms, I believe. And there you are. So what it did was it when I submitted the feedback form, I was using two backends. So the log backend just logged the thing out, but I was also using the database backend, which persisted what my user, me in this case, submitted into a database. And that's how forms work. But that's like, let's kind of dig a bit deeper into the form itself, right? So let's do this. Let me show you. So I told you about the philosophy, right? Like give information to the users and get information from the users, right? So the give part is a page, right? So it is defined by the page decorator. The get part is unsurprisingly a form decorator. And then you define a function. The thing that you'd immediately notice is different about the form function as opposed to a page function is that like page is one way, right? So you only ever, like when you render a page, a web page is like you're basically giving information to the users. But the form kind of works in two ways, right? So the first time you render a form, the form is empty, right? So you just like it's just like a page. But when someone submits some data in a form, that data is kind of like needs to be hooked to the form object, right? And it's the way the framework does it is by kind of popping it into the data argument in a function. So like over here. And then what you can do is when you're creating your form object, which is very similar to a page object, you can kind of make sure that like this, right? So you pass in the data that you received from the state machine back into the form object so that it knows that this time there is some data attached to the form, right? Okay, so let me talk about the form, right? So the first thing is you have to give a name to the form, right? So that's just like feedback here. And then Once you do that, you can have like just like a page, you can have arbitrary HTML elements in a form, right? In this case, we have a heading, we have a smaller heading and stuff like that. But a form does need to have some kind of input, right? So that's what makes it a form, right? So in this case, the input here is like radio. We know is an input, right? It allows users to click on stuff and submit, choose like one of the options and submit, right? So it is an input. So this is the input in a form. Um, we Fast-gov-uk implements the entire GDS design system, right? So that includes all of the inputs, right? So the radios, the checkboxes, the uh, password inputs, and etc., right? And you can find all of those here. Let me see. So design system in Python, and if you go to inputs, that's where all the inputs are, right? So all of the GDS design system inputs are here. But also Fast-gov-uk kind of comes out of the box with a bunch of inputs that are not necessarily like they're not part of the gov.uk design system, but they're often useful. And like if you're building a gov.uk service, you end up using one or more of these, right? So an email input, right? Like if you want to um, a decimal input, like that comes out of the box with the validation that whatever the user puts in that input is indeed a decimal number and not like a not text, stuff like that. GBP, uh, it comes with future date input, right? Which is like a gov.uk date input, but it has some validation to make sure that the date you entered is in the future, and blah blah blah. There's a lot of stuff in here. I can't cover all of it, but I would encourage you to read the docs. Um, anyway, so we define our forms. I talked about the backends, which is like what happens when the form is submitted and like how do you process it, right? So Fast-gov.uk comes out of the box with a bunch of backends. We are using two here. I demonstrated the use of two backends, which is the log backend and the database backend. Success URL is what it sounds like, right? Like when a form is submitted and it's valid, where do we redirect to, right? So that's in this case, we're redirecting to the home page. Data I talked about is like just to hook up when a form is submitted with data. You need to kind of hook it up with the form object so that it displays it correctly, and that's data. And CTA is like at the end of the form, there is a button, like what would be the label of the button, right? In this case, I like send feedback, but submit, whatever, right? Um, one thing that I'd like you to note, um, oh, before I do that, actually, let's try and break the form, right? So in this case, yeah, I want to show you the validation stuff, right? Because that's really cool and it kind of comes out of the box. So if I go here and I don't click anything and I send feedback, you get the standard like GDS style errors, right? And that comes out of the box with all of the inputs that you've implemented, right? So an email input, if you put something in there that's not an email, you get an error, right? And when you get an error, that means the form is not valid, right? Therefore, none of the backends get called up, right? So you don't actually process the form until it's valid. And all of this is out of the box, right? You use the right fields and you get the right validation, more or less. Um, we do accept pull requests, and there might be bugs. This is still alpha. What else? Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about. I wanted to talk about. Um, what was I? Yeah. So this is important, right? What would what I would encourage you to do is to really note and that the code for pages and the code for forms, this code is incredibly declarative, right? Like in its nature. You're defining what you want the page to look like. You're not having to do like state machine imperative stuff where like if you get a get request, do this. If you don't get a get request, do that. Like all of that is hidden from you when you want to define a page, you define a function that returns a page, and you define the page as you want the page to look like. So this page has a warning, an H1P, a list, whatever. This is very declarative, right? And it's similar for the form. When you're defining a form, you're defining what the form should look like. All of the gnarly bits of like, like if a user goes to the form page, show them the empty form, and then when they fill the form, right, like you check if it's valid, and if it's valid, you take them to you process the form and you take them to the redirect URL. If it's not valid, you check the errors into the form, you show them the forms with the errors as well as the bits like data that they submitted. All of that stuff is being taken care of by the underlying like framework, which is Fast-gov-uk, right? Like you don't have to do it, and that makes it incredibly easy. Like if you know a bit of Python and you want to build a bit of gov.uk service, right? Um, this is how you would do it, right? Because the code is so simple, like it's so readable because a lot of the gnarly stuff is being handled by the framework. Um, and the I mean, I haven't talked about AI in this video. The last one was like kind of went overboard with that. But essentially, the characteristic that when you need to define a form, you can define it declaratively. This works really well for like, I don't know, junior developers, right? Or even senior developers who care about the readability of the code base. But it works really well for AI agents, right? Because you can kind of model your AI agents in your head like as a junior developer, right? And what they're incredibly good at is that if you kind of give them the right abstractions so that they can build the form declaratively, they would build the form declaratively and they would do a decent job. The thing that they're not good at is becoming senior developers though. Anyway, this was forms. I hope you enjoyed this. Like this was more of a rough and ready kind of me just blabbing video. Very unlike the last one, which was a very sort of high level pitch on like what this does. Maybe in the next video. So if first of all, tell me if you like this. But even if you don't, in the next video, I would like to do is I'd like to dive in, right? I'd go inside the framework and show you how the forms and like the stuff like that, like the things that I keep mentioning that like the gnarly bits that are taken care of by the framework, how are they implemented? I think like a bunch of you would find um, this useful. So I'd do that. We take the same application, but we put my favorite bit in development is breakpoints. I am a driven development, right? I'm very good at that. So what we do is we do a bit of debugger driven development where we would put breakpoints everywhere, and then we would submit the form and follow follow the rabbit hole and see how the things work internally. Cool. I hope you like this video, and I'll see you for the next one. Have fun.